Good day to everybody. Thank you for joining this webinar organized by Carbon Market Watch, which is a speed run through the Article 6 outcome. We have 5 questions, we have 5 experts, and we look forward to the next hour debating this with them and with you involved in this discussion. It's really about Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which has been under negotiations, and a deal which was 5 years in the making was struck at COP26 in Glasgow, where countries, governments globally adopted new rules to regulate carbon markets under the Paris Agreement. As you know, this mostly regulates trades between countries, but it also has implications for voluntary carbon market offsetting schemes. And the aim of this session is to really take a more detailed look at what was agreed in Glasgow. What are the key takeaways from these rules? How does this affect the companies involved in them, the countries counting on them, and relying on carbon credits to meet their carbon targets? And what does it really ultimately mean for the atmosphere and for the people affected by these projects? So if you want to know more about the infamous Article 6 deal, and you want to know everything about it, but you have little time to dedicate to it, this is a perfect opportunity. And I'm glad to be joined by an excellent panel of experts here today. I'll introduce them in a minute. Before we dive right in, we have attempted to make this a little bit interactive. We have 2 short polls, one which should pop up on your screen in a moment, where you can really answer your general appreciation of the Article 6 deal, even before you had any information from us about this. So you can vote on your screen. We'll leave that open for a while I just mention a few housekeeping rules. So this is really a quick speed run through the Glasgow agreements. You'll hear in the next 20 minutes from the 5 experts we have gathered here. And each speaker will give a short and simple, straight to the point answer on specific questions we have prepared. I'll see people are still voting. After the introductions by the experts, we will open this up for question and answers with you, with the audience, for around the remaining half hour. And you can use for that the question and answer function at the bottom of your screen. Any questions are welcome. If you already have some, you can type them now, but you will have the chance to do so during the whole session. The question and answer function should also allow you to vote for questions which have been asked by others. So you can vote, you can upvote your preferred questions. We hope that works out, and I'll endeavor to also make sure the most popular questions are answered by our panelists. So with that, I think we can close this poll and also share the results. Or is this what we see on the screen already? I believe it is, right? So when looking at the Article 6 deal, most participants right now, a bit less than half, consider it okay. So it's halfway there, glass half full or glass half empty. But we also, I'm glad to see, it's nothing to be ashamed of. We have a good bunch of participants who are not sure, and I hope we can improve that going through this session together. So I believe we can close this poll right now and then dive right in. I'll move on to our experts. I'll introduce every one of them when we get to them, and I'll start by moving directly to Nico Kruipich, who is research fellow at the Wuppertal Institute. And as you know, a lot of the discussions around Article 6 and how to move that forward was also how to deal with the old system established under the Kyoto Protocol, the clean development mechanisms. A lot of those, at Carbon Market Watch, we have labeled them zombie credits, are still around. And we look forward to hear from you, Nico. What happened to these old credits, and when will the new system start? Over to you. Thanks for joining.
So thank you, Sam. Thanks for the invitation to Carbon Market Watch. Yeah, what happens to the old system, to these zombie credits, and maybe also zombie projects, you could say. In Glasgow, what parties have agreed are two main things with regards to the CDM. One thing is the transition of credits, or the use of credits in the future. So parties will be able to use CDM credits that have already been issued from projects that were registered after 2012. And parties will be, or countries will be able to use these credits for their NDCs. And this is, of course, problematic, as you said, the zombie credits. These are credits that are old and are reluctant or relying on emission reductions that have been achieved regardless of the decision made in Glasgow. So this is really problematic in my view. So these units from Kyoto mechanisms should not be used for the achievement of post-2020 targets, neither for countries, NDCs, nor for corporate carbon neutrality claims. So it relates to both the voluntary carbon market also. However, it remains to be seen whether they will actually find a buyer. And we hope, of course, not. So hopefully these will not be used. With regards to the transition of projects here, parties have also, in Glasgow, they have agreed that CDM projects can register under the new system, under the Article 6.4 mechanism, if they meet the requirements of this new system. But here also, this is quite problematic, since most of these projects would continue operating even without the possibility to transition to the new system. So this could allow for projects with low quality enter the new system, enter the Article 6.4 mechanism. And it remains unclear whether host countries, so the countries in which these activities are based, whether they will authorize these credits or these projects and the respective credits. Parties have also agreed on, as you said, they have introduced the new system, which basically has two parts. One is the Article 6.4 mechanism. And this mechanism, which is quite similar to the CDM, and it's how it works. This is will be guided or governed by UN rules. There is an international oversight, and these credits that are generated under this new mechanism, they can be used for NDC achievement. So, as you asked, when will the new system start? This is, of course, a challenging question. I think you can say that it will take about 2 to 3 years. If you look at the work plan of the new body, if you look at the infrastructure that has to be installed at the international level, but also at the national level. And it might also depend on how the new body interacts with the existing infrastructure developed under the CDM. So this process will be supported by the clean development mechanism. Then we have the second element, the second new element of this of the new system, which is the Article 6.2 framework. It's a framework for bilateral or multilateral cooperation. So it allows countries to establish cooperative approaches, so a cooperation between countries, and to transfer units and use these units for NDC achievement. Here, I think you can say that this system is already up and running. There are countries have already established some cooperative approaches, so they are already cooperating. And so this implementation will now can continue with more clarity now that the rules are there. And at the same time, the infrastructure has to be established at UN level, but also at the national level. And here, possibly some support will be required for some parties. So that's my take on the timeline question. Back to you, Sam.
Thank you very much, Nico. That's very helpful, including that nuance between Article 6.2 and 6.4, and also pointing out for anybody who thought where Article 6 deal is now done and dusted, there's probably still a lot more work to come where the devil will be in the detail in the coming years. I think 2 to 3 years, that's an interesting timeline to have out there already to keep in mind for all stakeholders involved in this. I'll move on to the next topic, which is double counting, and something which has been a major area of controversy in the COPs preceding the Glasgow agreement, and a lot of disagreement between governments negotiating this. Harry, I'll move over to you. Is this now, and Harry Farnow is climate policy analyst at the New Climate Institute, is double counting now prevented? And I mean, a way governments were looking at this was to apply corresponding adjustments. How will this now be done in practice?
Thanks, Sam. Hello, everyone. I'll just start maybe answering this with a bit of background. So what is double counting, and how is it relevant to the environmental integrity of a carbon credit? And in essence, the key question is quite simple. So a carbon credit is a certificate guaranteeing the permanent avoidance or removal of 1 ton of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And to use a credit to offset or neutralize emissions released elsewhere, it's critical that each one of these credits and the underlying reductions they represent are only counted once towards the mitigation targets. There are different forms of double counting, different potential forms of double counting, but perhaps the most relevant here is if there are multiple claims of ownership for the outcome. For example, if a buyer, either a country or a company, uses a credit to offset its emissions at the same time as the country where the reductions occurred, also reporting the outcome in its own inventory. And avoiding this is fundamental, I would say, a basic principle of trading carbon credits. Yet, despite this, and as you mentioned, Sam, there was a clear risk in the political negotiations in the run-up to this COP, and that covered many years, that agreement couldn't be reached on provisions to avoid double counting. So what is the Article 6 text that we have? What does it say? The rules require countries authorizing the transfer of credits reflecting emission reductions implemented within their own jurisdiction, so often referred to as host countries, to apply what's termed a corresponding adjustment to the emissions they report against their own target. And this accounting adjustment serves to ensure the abatement is only counted one time by the credit buyer and not, crucially, by the seller. So, for example, if the government of Bangladesh were to authorize the transfer of 1 million credits from a project that reduces emissions within Bangladesh, it would then need to add this volume, so 1 megaton of carbon dioxide, to its reported actual emissions for the purposes of determining whether or not it meets its own climate target. So far, so good. In reality, it's not as simple as it sounds. National targets under the Paris Agreement are expressed in a number of different ways. Many countries have a climate target for a single year. Some targets only cover certain sectors or types of greenhouse gases. And some targets are not even expressed in terms of emissions or emission reductions, but other metrics. And this heterogeneity across national targets makes accounting, particularly when looking at trading outcomes, challenging. On the positive side, the rules agreed in Glasgow clarify that a corresponding adjustment must be made for all credits that are authorized for transfer by the seller country. This includes those that reflect emission reductions outside the current scope of a country's NDC coverage. It also includes credits that might be used for other international mitigation purposes, such as CORSIA, so the scheme to regulate international aviation emissions, as well as potential use by voluntary actors, such as corporates, to meet their own pledges. And the rules also clarify that all exchanges must be quantified in terms of a common unit, so tons of carbon dioxide equivalents, which is really essential to have that robust accounting. However, there are some key limitations in the rulebook, both through its design as well as more or less the limits of its coverage. First, a key point. So countries with single-year climate targets, and these are by far the majority, can select how they account for either the sale or use of credits over the implementation period of their NDC, depending on which is relevant. For example, a country that might authorize the transfer of credits for reductions delivered from, say, 2023 to 2030, but having a target level that just refers to its emissions in 2030. And one option here is to translate its target into an emissions trajectory over the relevant years, or effectively a carbon budget, and then directly apply accounting adjustments corresponding to when the emission reductions took place. And this approach is relatively unproblematic from an accounting perspective. But an alternative option provided for in the rulebook is what's called averaging, where the size of the adjustment is determined by the average number of credits bought or sold over the NDC implementation period. And this can be problematic. Without going too much into the details, in some cases, this leads to accounting adjustments, so corresponding adjustments in the target year, so the year the target applies or is relevant to, that are not equal to the volume of credits that are either bought or sold in that particular year. And analysis of various different possible permutations or scenarios of this averaging approach has clearly shown that it can lead to, in certain contexts and under certain conditions, an overall increase in global emissions, effectively facilitating double counting. It won't necessarily do that, but at least it can do, and a key weakness is that countries can choose, if they wish to apply this approach. And finally, I think it's important to clarify that the Article 6 rulebook does not explicitly regulate the voluntary carbon market. I think there's a lot of interest in certainly a booming voluntary carbon market at the moment. This is not a big surprise. It's mostly a function of the remit of the UNFCCC, which is very much focused at the national level. But what has been possible in the rulebook is that the text allows countries to authorize credits for use by voluntary buyers, such as companies, and it clarifies that these authorized units will be backed with corresponding adjustments. However, the text remains relatively silent on whether it may still be possible for the new Article 6.4 mechanism to issue what would effectively be non-authorized units to voluntary buyers that are not backed by a corresponding adjustment. If this were possible, and it really remains open to interpretation, using these to claim to offset emissions could effectively lead to double counting. So in summary, the rules agreed in Glasgow provide the mechanism and I would say welcome clarifications on many aspects critical to avoid double counting. I think they exceeded the expectations of some, certainly. However, while some of the worst case outcomes for double counting the same emission reductions were avoided, the rules still leave open loopholes for what should be, in essence, a fundamental principle of using carbon credits for offsetting. So this means we need full transparency on how actors, both buyers and sellers, as well as market intermediaries, make use of carbon markets now and in the years to come. And we need to ramp up scrutiny in the market to ensure that the potential loopholes or opportunities for double counting do not actually materialize. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harry, for taking us through some of the real intricacies. I think this is a highly complex, and it really matters what is in the agreement there. You point out that some of the worst, maybe cheating, has been avoided in Glasgow, but it's definitely not excluded in the future, and that will be a major point of attention, because ultimately cheating the atmosphere is something you cannot do physically, and something to which also all governments need to be accountable, including the voluntary markets in this going forward. Let me move on to our next speaker, which is Catalina Gonda. She's with the climate policy team of FARN, based in Argentina. Moving on to the topic of carbon markets delivering climate finance and carbon markets delivering global emission reductions, going beyond zero-sum offsetting, as we have seen in the past. A lot of talks were about the so-called share of proceeds under Article 6 and around the need to deliver overall mitigation in global emissions. Both of these topics have their own acronyms in the jargon, and I'll hand over to you, Catalina, to explain, does Article 6 deliver climate and adaptation finance now, and how does it go beyond zero-sum offsetting?
Well, thanks, Sam. I hope my internet connection is okay. But yeah, just let me know if I start cutting out. But yeah, so to what extent this new market approaches would generate funding for climate adaptation was one of the key political issues being discussed under Article 6 negotiations, and perhaps one of the biggest priorities for countries that are being hit hardest by climate change. So given that current funding for adaptation is not nearly enough of what is needed by developing countries, many of these vulnerable nations were pushing for what is known as, what you mentioned, the share of proceeds for adaptation. So basically to set aside a percentage of emission reduction credits to fund adaptations, to put it simply. And they were pushing for this on all Article 6 market approaches. But the rules agreed in Glasgow fixed a small tariff on emission trading to be channeled towards the adaptation fund, so a 5% tariff, but just for one part of Article 6, so just for one of its two carbon market approaches. And instead, countries transferring credits through these ad hoc or bilateral agreements are encouraged, but they're not obliged to contribute to adaptation funding, which eliminates potentially important sources for adaptation finance. And then in terms of whether Article 6 goes beyond this zero-sum offsetting, this is perhaps one of the most critical points, because at a best case scenario, these offsetting mechanisms basically neutralize emissions rather than delivering net global emission reductions, which is what we need to do very sharply and very rapidly in the next decades if we want to stay below 1.5. So how do we actually achieve this overall emission reductions through these offsetting mechanisms instead of just moving pollution around the globe? Well, many argue that the only safe and simple way of doing so is through a mandatory cancellation of a percentage of these credits at issuance, which basically means that some of these credits are taken off the table and cannot be used to offset countries' emissions or used towards their national climate commitments. So in terms of the outcome, Article 6 rules included a measure that would automatically cancel only 2% of emission reduction units generated under one of these mechanisms, just the 6.4 carbon market mechanism, which is a very low percentage and only applies to part of Article 6. And again, for the other approach, for this kind of bilateral agreements, there is no required cancellation of part of the credits, but it's only strongly encouraged. So this is quite worrisome, especially when we know that national climate pledges now are highly insufficient, And there's a huge mitigation gap that needs to be bridged in order to get us on track for the 1.5 degree goal. So just to summarize, I think the rules agreed in Glasgow fell short in guiding international carbon markets towards increasing funds for adaptations, which are actually right now very low, and reaching the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement.
Thank you, Catalina, for explaining this very clearly. So very, very modest percentages in the final text, it seems, and something which definitely can and should be increased going forward. I'll move on to the next speaker, which is Erica Lennon. She's senior attorney at the Center for International Environmental Law. And we've invited Erica to also speak about how these projects and how carbon markets affect people in reality. It's not only about the tons of CO2, but this affects real life, as we have seen in the past very clearly, and a lot of negative examples there under the clean development mechanism. And so for you, Erica, really the question, do you think people and the environment are sufficiently protected against negative local impacts under this agreement?
Thanks, Sam, and thanks to Carbon Market Watch for inviting me. And quite simply, the answer is no, it's not. I think on a positive note, we did see in the discussions around Article 6, especially in Glasgow, more emphasis and discussion around human rights, including the rights of Indigenous peoples, than we had in the past. And there are some positives. The rules across Article 6 do mention and include references to human rights, including the rights of Indigenous peoples, including gender equality, and reflecting the elements that are contained in the preamble of the Paris Agreement. But it doesn't really go far enough to ensure that we're protecting communities, that we're protecting people on the ground, and that they won't be impacted by carbon market activities in the way that we've seen through the Clean Development Mechanism. And to be clear, the Clean Development Mechanism didn't have any of these things in place to protect people or human rights. So this is a positive step forward. But what we see in the rules related to sort of the cooperative approaches under 6.2 is that in the reporting, countries will have to report on how the activities reflect the principles of reflect human rights, reflect Indigenous peoples' rights, reflect gender equality. And in 6.4, and this goes to maybe a point that Nico made earlier about how it's going to take a while for the system to be put in place. In 6.4, the main place where we see human rights reflected is in one of the tasks of the supervisory body. And so the supervisory body governing that mechanism will have to establish sort of what the requirements are as they operate the mechanism, including how to avoid negative environmental and social impacts, how to ensure that human rights and the rights of Indigenous peoples are respected. But parties miss the opportunity to include those rules in activity design. So saying that the activities themselves had to ensure they protected human rights, that they protected the rights of Indigenous peoples. They also missed the opportunity to include reference to international human rights standards generally, including important ones like ensuring the right of Indigenous peoples to free, prior, and informed consent. So there's a reference to needing to do consultation with local stakeholders, but it's caveated with things like according to domestic arrangements, not according to international law. It doesn't mention free, prior, and informed consent at all. And so there's a lot left to be desired about whether or not these projects will actually adequately protect people on the ground as we go forward. And I will say there is one of the things that had been missing from past mechanisms was any sort of grievance process and a real robust grievance process. And at the last minute in Glasgow, we did see the addition of reference to an independent grievance process. But what this is and how it will be set up and how robust it will be and the ability for communities to ensure the access to the right to remedy is yet to be determined and is one of those things that still needs to be negotiated. And so there's still work to do to really ensure that the market activities themselves don't undermine people's human rights, don't see people displaced, don't see land grabbing, and to make sure that in the implementation, they're actually respecting human rights. And so that will be an ongoing project. And the last thing I'll say is that while the rules themselves do include these references, and it's great to see that the actual rules and in the actual text of the rules, there are references to human rights. As I think Nico mentioned with carryover of credits, as Harry mentioned with potential for double counting, and as Catalina mentioned with not, a very low percentage and not going far enough to ensure the reduction of the overall mitigation of global emissions, human rights and the rights of Indigenous peoples are being impacted now. The climate crisis is a human rights crisis. And if we don't actually reduce emissions, if all we're doing is offsetting around the world, people's human rights are going to be impacted more and more. And so just the having of the markets, if the markets aren't actually contributing to emissions reductions, will ultimately undermine human rights themselves. Thanks.
Thank you, Erica, and thanks a lot for taking it back to this overall challenge at the very end. And I'll move on to the last speaker, which is my colleague Jonathan Crook, also at Carbon Market Watch. And basically, question for you: Carbon Market Watch has said coming into these discussions, and I think we've repeated it over multiple COPs, that no deal is better than a bad deal. So Jonathan, is this a good deal?
Yeah, thank you, Sam. I think just to put it clearly, I think from our perspective at Carbon Market Watch, Article 6 is not a good deal overall. And that's because of loopholes that remain and the numerous problematic compromises that were made to finalize this deal. And the fact is that these loopholes and compromises threaten to weaken climate action and to increase emissions, which is exactly the opposite of the goal of the Paris Agreement. So kind of tying back into Nico's presentation, countries being able to use up to an estimated of 300 million old and by and large junk credits from the Kyoto Protocol is not going to help us achieve current climate targets. And the fact that the provisions for transitioning CDM projects, that they can even continue to use their old and often flawed CDM methodologies until as late as 2025, even though these projects don't rely for the most part on carbon credit revenue to actually operate, is really problematic, because that's failing one of the most basic requirements to be able to issue carbon credits. And I'm sure Harry can actually speak to this a bit more, but if all these CDM, because it comes from research that he's done, but if all these CDM projects were to transition, it could generate as much as 3 billion credits. So yeah, definitely the stakes are high. And despite this, some might still say, that there are some positive elements in the Article 6 deal. So for instance, if you consider, as Catalina spoke to, this 2% cancellation rate under 6.4, as well as the share of proceeds going to adaptation. Agreeing with Catalina, of course, that these rates are too low. And so yes, but there are some positive elements there. And it's important that those elements, like this, saying that there's no more zero-sum offsetting, it also does send an important signal to actors in the voluntary carbon markets that they should take note of the fact that all countries that have ratified the Paris Agreement agreed that there's no place for zero-sum offsetting and that carbon credits need to support climate adaptation efforts. I think overall, the fact is that even just with some positive elements, they don't make up for the serious shortcomings that we see that undermine environmental integrity and could infringe on human rights, as Erica spoke to. And of course, this is framed again, the reminder that first and foremost, we can't forget that countries, businesses need to be significantly reducing their emissions in the first place before actually resorting to carbon markets. So all of that being said, I think going forward, it's important to remember that work in Article 6 is not finished yet. And civil society and other stakeholders have a really important sort of twofold role to play. So first is, I would say, holding countries accountable. For instance, if they use these low quality Kyoto Protocol credits to achieve their current targets, or if they kind of indiscriminately allow their domestic CDM projects to transition. And second is to closely follow the key outstanding aspects of the Article 6 rules that will be finalized by countries in the coming months and years, and to seek to improve those outcomes. Because the reality is, whether we like it or not, Article 6 is here to stay, and it will be used. So what we need to do now is minimize potential damages, put up safeguards, and hold countries accountable for misuse, essentially. So I think on that, I can probably wrap up close.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Jonathan. And with that, we have gone through quickly and effectively through all these questions. We'll dive into the question and answers in a moment. But before doing so, I would like to launch the second poll now, which is, I think, a bit more nuanced than the one we showed earlier, to get some more of your appreciation of this deal now that we've heard from all speakers. I hope you can see it on your screen right now. Yes, I can, which is really rating this deal from a scale from 1 to 5, and you still have the option, if after all this it's not clear to say, you still don't know whether it's a good or a bad deal. While this is running, again, a reminder, the question and answers function is open at the bottom of your screen. You can type your questions, or you can also upvote questions which have been asked by others. I see a lot of people are still replying to the poll, so I'll dive into the Q&A session so that we don't waste time. And the one which is on top, it's just moving, but I'll go into the question raised by Aita in the Q&A now, which is about the risk of double counting in voluntary markets. So Aita asks, based on the understanding that a voluntary carbon market credit is generated, the related emission reductions should be counted only in the host country greenhouse gas inventory. So the question is, where would be the double counting? So this also has to do with the need to regulate the claims made by corporates on the back of voluntary markets. But the question from Aita is that they don't see a risk of double counting. Harry, as you spoke to this, could you elaborate on that a little bit more, please?
Yeah, certainly. And I think it really depends on the setup here. So that there are a number of different, I guess, combinations or scenarios that could play out. I think what's critical, so the Article 6 rulebook now facilitates, and it's pretty explicit, although using the kind of the technical jargon that at least those of us working in this space are maybe familiar with, but it facilitates now that countries can really authorize credits for use outside of Article 6, so outside of kind of trading between countries, and for, I think, what the text has in mind there is particularly CORSIA and the voluntary market. So the countries can then authorize their use and apply corresponding adjustments, so adjusting their own emissions balance relative to, or in relation to, their target. And this would then avoid the risk of double counting in this context. But I think, and maybe that's also where some of this question comes in. It's also possible, certainly possible, and I think certainly a model that we're seeing increasingly that voluntary and particularly corporate actors are moving towards, which is comes under different names, but effectively a climate contribution. So where corporates can effectively support a country in achieving its NDC target, and therefore channeling finance in support of this, also sort of referred to as results-based financing. And I think this is a very attractive model. It's a model that our institute, so New Climate Institute, where I work, is effectively doing to address our own climate kind of responsibility. But what's critical, and where the key risk here is, and we're seeing this a lot. If you look at a lot of the big players and amongst buyers in the voluntary market today, they're actually offsetting their emissions, and that's critical. So if a voluntary buyer claims that actually its own emissions, the emissions actually released through its own activities or the activities that it effectively encourages, if it offsets those or claims to offset them, then it's absolutely critical that a corresponding adjustment is applied. If not, then this buyer is claiming to own the emission reductions corresponding to the credit, potentially as well as the host country, and that's really where the risk is. So that's avoided if there's no offsetting claim, and I think that perhaps within the question comes to the point about regulating claims, or it's avoided where there's the application of a corresponding adjustment by the host country.
Thank you, Harry. And so if I understand you correctly, that risk also applies to CORSIA, which I believe answers another question we had coming in from the aviation team at Transport and Environment.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I could also very briefly on that. Of course, for CORSIA, we don't know which credits will be eligible in the future. I think there's an expectation that those credits issued by the new Article 6.4 mechanism and authorized by host countries will be eligible, but we don't know. And also there are other programs, at least currently accepted under CORSIA.
Thanks a lot, Harry. We can actually have a brief look to the outcome of the poll now. I think it's still on your screen, and I see most people have voted by now. I think it's fair to say we at least have already succeeded to alleviate some of the confusion around Article 6. Some people are still scratching their head, but it's become a minority, so that's great to see. The other observation I have here is, I guess generally the glass is a bit less than half empty on the Article 6 deal, and I think that's also perhaps no surprise with what we just heard from our experts. I'll move on to the next question, which is also a bit more detail around making this market operational. I hope Nico can help to answer that. You already spoke, I think, to the timeline related to the negotiations, 2 to 3 years. But the question here is, when will we see the first carbon credits being generated and traded? Is this year? And if not, when?
Yeah, as I said, difficult question to assess this, but I think, yeah, if you look at in particular in Article 6.4, you have a supervisory body which will meet, I think, twice this year, so, or next year, 2022. So that's what they agreed, but they have to establish the entire system, and this system involves the accreditation of verification. So DOEs, it's designated operational entities. So these are entities that validate the projects or activities that verify the certificates. They have to agree on methodologies for approving and validating these new methodologies. So these are all processes that have to be established. So in my view, it will not be this year, so and not next year, not 2022, but it will take some more time. So my guess is 3 years. That's for Article 6.4. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Nico, and that also answers kind of the type of decisions which need to happen in the meantime, which is one of the other questions we got. Moving on to the next one, which is a question to if someone can clarify the relationship between Article 6.2 and 6.4. The question is specifically, does the international transfer of carbon credits from 6.4 need to adhere to the rules of 6.2? I'm looking at my panelists. If someone wants to answer this, please raise your hand. Jonathan, please go ahead. Thanks.
Yeah, so also just to mention back on the about whether or not one credits will be issued. So ITMOs will probably can already be issued and traded potentially. So that's under 6.2. Some countries are already in far ahead in talks on that. So Switzerland, for instance. But yeah, to get back to that question. So 6.2 is, 6.4 activities qualify under 6.2. So in those cases, all the 6.4 rules would apply if it were being used as an ITMO. It gets a bit technical on the details. And under 6.4, I think one of the links to 6.2 is that the details concerning corresponding adjustments are defined inside kind of the 6.2 rules. So those aspects about corresponding adjustments are defined in 6.2 and will be reflected in this global carbon market under 6.4, to kind of put it a bit succinctly. So I think that that's kind of the strongest link between 6.2 and 6.4. I'm probably blanking on something else that's important, but just to keep it short and concise, I can just stop right there.
Thank you, Jonathan, for clarifying that. Next question is about the commonalities, but I guess also the differences between Article 6 and the clean development mechanism established under the Kyoto Protocol. In terms of methodologies, projects, carryover of credits, can someone of the panel, maybe Nico or if someone else wants, please feel free. What are the main differences and how are they significant?
Yeah, maybe I'll start and then others can jump in.
Thanks.
I think the key difference is, and where maybe some observers say it's better. It's a basic thing or basic fact that on the Paris, all countries have nationally determined contributions. So all countries have targets. This means this was different under the Kyoto Protocol. So the functioning of carbon markets is fundamentally different. Host countries, so those countries where the activities are being implemented, they now have the interest to really export only emission reductions that come from emissions that are additional and high quality, and that was linked to the corresponding adjustments and the need to account for these exports. So this is fundamentally different. At least if countries have ambitious NDCs, there is an inherent incentive for these countries to really control what they are exporting. This was different on the CDM. And there are also other areas, methodologies mentioned, where these are more ambitious or will be more robust under Article 6.4. That's at least what we expect or what we hope. So it's no longer possible to simply develop projects on the baseline by looking at the historic emissions or the business as usual situation. So here they have made significant improvements. Yeah, I think one point that I would have liked to see there, I've seen there is the role of ambition raising, which is not as robustly operationalized as I would have expected or hoped for. So this in this aspect, the new system will be an offsetting system basically. So yeah, but yeah, maybe others can also add.
Yeah, thank you, Nico. I'm wondering, maybe I can ask Erica in terms of the impacts on local population and human rights. How do you perceive the differences and commonalities there?
Yeah, and I think there's still a lot to be seen about how different it will actually be in its setup, the 6.4 mechanism from the clean development mechanism. But from the start, you know, I think a key difference is the start that there should be, you know, there needs to be rules and respect for avoiding negative environmental and social impacts. There needs to be rules for the respect for human rights and the rights of indigenous peoples and women and others, that there is a requirement, albeit a requirement that doesn't go far enough, on consulting with local communities, because obviously, you know, local communities should be involved in the development of projects that are going to impact them either positively or negatively. And so those things incorporated in the rules from the start that need to be incorporated into the 6.4 mechanism didn't exist with the clean development mechanism. And so there's the opportunity for the 6.4 mechanism to not repeat these past mistakes by making sure that, like, the rules and the safeguards that are developed and that the supervisory body is looking at as it's looking at projects really do make sure they're protecting human rights, really do ensure robust consultation, including requirements around international law and free, prior, and informed consent, even though it's not explicitly mentioned in these rules. And for the development of a robust independent grievance mechanism, so that when, you know, if communities are harmed, as we've seen with past projects and is likely to be seen, they have somewhere to go on to seek remedy, which they haven't had in the past when they've been harmed by carbon market projects. So I think there are opportunities there in these rules to do that, but obviously there's a lot to still be determined, and the proof will be in how those requirements are established going forward, and then how things are implemented, obviously.
Thank you, Erica. I see Harry, you wanted to comment on this one as well?
Yeah, I can briefly say, I mean, I think the good points were already mentioned, and I mean, I think it's a really good question. And I think there are, from my view, maybe too many sort of commonalities from the CDM. I mean, we're in a completely different place now. The Paris Agreement is fundamentally different. I mean, Nico set out the basics, but also the climate emergency that we face now is and the body of knowledge we have about what we need to do is completely different. And I think what's critical for Article 6 is these kind of the methodologies. And we need to see what comes from it, but they need to be ramping up to a completely different level of ambition and really driving you know, what many call the high-hanging fruit. So completely changing what carbon markets in the past, the type of mitigation options they've looked at addressing. And to be honest, we don't see at least enough noise and enough movement in that direction at the moment. I think it's critical that those that then start working on these methodologies and approving them need to be thinking in a completely different kind of level and different types of abatement to what's happened in the past. And I think it also is important that that involves new people, new individuals to bring in that kind of expertise, and also to change things, to make sure we're not doing kind of CDM 2.0. There are some good starting points, that's clear, that we can use, but we also need to be completely changing the kind of the game and where this is used, if it's really an ambition raising mechanism for the Paris Agreement targets.
Thank you, Harry, and thanks everybody. There's a lot to unpack here and a lot to learn from the past mistakes and improve the system going forward. I'll take a couple of more questions. Moving on to the topic of climate finance, we discussed it earlier. There's a question considering that voluntary carbon markets are also considered an important mechanism to channel international private climate finance to implement the NDCs, wouldn't requiring corresponding adjustments to all units be detrimental to the climate finance target? So if you consider the voluntary carbon markets just climate finance, that wouldn't mean double counting, right? And maybe I can turn this one to Catalina, if you want, and if you can shed some light on that, that would be very helpful. Thanks.
Sure. Yes, sure. I can give a quick reflection, and then I would be happy for others to jump in as well. I think it is a matter of kind of labeling what kind of contribution the private sector is doing, because I don't see that applying corresponding adjustments would be detrimental to climate finance. I think that there should be a very honest messaging from the private sector in terms of if they're using a credit towards their carbon neutrality commitments, then that should not be also counted by the host country. And I think that it's just a matter of it could be misleading to do so, in my opinion. So I think that if you could apply corresponding adjustments to all units, but have this emission reductions owned by the companies or the entity that acquires them, but not for offsetting their emissions, but rather as a contribution to reducing the host country's emissions, or yes, like a financial contribution to achieve their NDCs, then I think that will be very clear, and that would not be detrimental to climate finance at all, because it would allow for unlocking a lot of private climate finance, but it would also avoid this kind of maybe controversial messaging. But yes, I mean, that's my general take on this topic, but I think it would be also interesting to hear from my other colleagues here.
Thank you, Catalina. Any other thoughts on this? Harry and Nico?
Yeah, just to, say also within the sort of in Glasgow, there was some of the iterations of the text also actually explicitly referred to, I think, Paris Agreement support units, I think was the label, that didn't make it into the final text, but effectively looking at and kind of more explicitly this what could now become a kind of non-authorized unit, which is hopefully something that won't be used, at least with that sort of terminology. I think there is definitely space for the private sector to be channeling climate finance. I think there's also another topic here, that is really relevant, that international climate finance targets, so the targets that or the pledges that certainly the wealthiest countries have made are well short. Well, sorry, the finance is well short of the pledges, and this needs to be happening well before we start getting into trading credits. Yeah, and I think that's absolutely fundamental, that the finance is needed, and that needs to be delivered also by governments, and certainly before they start engaging in actually purchasing offset credits and transferring them outside of the host countries.
Okay, thank you very much. We're rapidly approaching the hour. I will squeeze in one more question, if you allow me, and then we'll close off, because I think this one was interesting as well, about using carbon markets for emission removals, especially as they're considered relevant to achieve net zero or negative emission targets. Maybe Jonathan, can you shed some light on this, please?
Yeah, sure. So again, just a quick recap would be that under 6.2 and 6.4, removals are included as a category. So that means that they could be technology-based removals like direct air capture, or it could be from kind of nature-based projects that are like afforestation or something that removes CO2 effectively. So I think there's a distinction, if direct air capture credits are then being used, so actually no, for the sake of time, we'll just focus on one aspect. Basically, for a lot of these nature-based solution projects, The problem is not providing finance to these projects because they can be important, but the issue is attributing a carbon credit to it because there's problems with permanence. You know, again, you'd have to guarantee that emission reduction remains removed for a long period of time. So CO2 stays in the atmosphere for 300 to 1,000 years to more, and you really just can't guarantee that the CO2 is stocked. I mean, the carbon stocked in a tree is going to last for that long. It could be cut down. There could be many other problems that are called reversals. And actually, this is one element where the CDM is kind of interesting because they issued temporary credits for these nature-based credits are under a temporary status. So they would expire after a given number of years, precisely to reflect the fact that they're not permanent. And that actually was an interesting element of the CDM that has not made it so far into Paris Agreement. So I think the main risk is, again, this is just offsetting something which you don't know actually will offset it, is the main problem, I would say. So.
Thank you for clarifying that, Jonathan. So with that, we've exhausted our time. I realize there are just 2 questions left, but we have addressed the majority. I'm proud of our speakers to have shared so many of their views and expertise on this. It's been very helpful. And I mean, with that, I think it's fair to conclude, whether we like it or not, the rule book of the Paris Agreement is completed. But this agreement clearly still requires a lot of work, not only in terms of the concerns which have been voiced here, the challenges, but also in terms of the actual negotiating process. And I think it's fair to say also the challenge for climate integrity, the challenge for upholding human rights now really moves to the implementation of this Article 6 agreement. And at Carbon Market Watch, we will use all the opportunities which are there to help to fix some of the problems which are still there and which have been left unresolved by the negotiator, the governments which came together in Glasgow. We really look forward to continuing the work with all of you, not only those on the panel, but also the many attendees, the participants, to continue to work next year to make that happen. We have something in the pipeline which we will send to all participants also as a thank you. It's a frequently asked questions document on Article 6, which you can use as a reference to refer to if you're lost in this maze again, and you will receive that shortly in your inboxes. There's nothing left for me to say then. Again, a very big thank you to all speakers and the experts which have joined here, helping us navigate through this, and thank you to all participants for joining us, and we look forward to see you in the next occasion. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.